Hello everyone. Tonight, we begin with a war where no one declares it, no one finishes it, and sometimes, no one even remembers why it started. You're not being drafted. You're being dreamt into combat by a shaman on the other side of the river. You don't get armor, you get a 6-foot blowgun, a dart dipped in paralyzing poison, and a silent nod from your grandmother. And if you survive, you might get a new wife, a new name, or a new spirit haunting your hammock. We'll follow the kind of war that begins in silence and ends in somebody's bones being stirred into banana paste. From hallucinogenic battle visions to funerals that escalate into murder, welcome to a style of conflict where everything is sacred, including revenge. If you enjoy strange histories, quiet chaos, and deeply inconvenient spirits, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to spend more nights like this one. And if you're watching this curled up under a blanket, half asleep, or halfway through a cold Tuesday night, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I read every one of them, even the cryptic ones. Now, dim the lights, maybe steep a bitter tea, let the jungle in for a moment, its breath, its breathlessness, and settle in, because the war's already begun. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Not the digital version of you who panics when the Wi-Fi hiccups, but the you who was born into the soft mud of a riverbank village in the upper Amazon. No birth certificate, just mosquito bites, a feathered rattle, and your grandmother declaring you looked suspiciously like her cousin who was eaten by a jaguar. Lovely start. And you're not just any villager. You're a future warrior though. No one's going to tell you that directly. That's the thing. Amazonian war doesn't come with declarations, parades, or snazzy uniforms. It arrives like a headache, sudden, unprovoked, and usually right before dinner. There's no front line. There's barely a side. Your enemy could be from the next clearing over, or from a myth passed down through 8 generations of he said, she said, then someone ate someone. You won't know you're at war until a blowgun dart makes a surprise visit to someone's neck. That's how it begins. Not with drums or banners, but with a silence so deep the parrots stop heckling, and even the frogs get nervous. You might be fishing, singing, flirting, or halfway through peeling a manioc root when you spot it. Movement that doesn't belong, a branch that bends the wrong way, a whisper that carries too well. Then someone coughs blood, and the village is on fire. Amazonian warfare isn't about land, it's about reputation, memory, old insults that fester like bad fruit. Maybe your uncle stole a woman. Maybe your grandfather killed someone in a dream. Maybe nobody remembers why anymore, only that your enemies exist, and they must be reminded who they're not allowed to mess with. So raids happen. Not wars, raids. Swift, brutal, and surgical. They don't come to conquer, they come to remind. It's like leaving a flaming calling card shaped like your great-grandfather's revenge, and you're part of the reminder. If you're lucky, you make it to the bushes before the screaming starts. If you're not, you wake up face down in the river wondering why your cousin just stepped over your body without blinking. Spoiler, it's because your cousin saw this coming. He's been watching the trails for weeks, noting whose footprints appeared and didn't leave. He's also been secretly microdosing snuff powder and dreaming of your death, for your protection. Of course, there's no training montage, no final warning. There's just the forest, and what it chooses to tell those who know how to listen. That's how real warriors track enemies. Through dreams, through gut feeling, through the sudden absence of birdsong and the wrong kind of leaf underfoot. You learn quickly that in the Amazon, silence isn't golden, it's loaded. And just when you think it's over, the fire put out, the wounded groaning, the ceremonial spears scattered like a bad joke, someone points out that this was just the first strike, a message, not a massacre, which means you're expected to respond, probably before breakfast, preferably without crying, definitely with poison. And this is where it starts to get interesting. You'd think that after a blood-soaked raid, a village might take a moment to process, reflect, rebuild, maybe install a fence. But Amazonian villagers don't do fences. They do faith, familiarity, and a quiet agreement with the forest to keep watch while everyone sleeps. It's not that they can't build walls, it's that they won't. Because in this part of the world, defense isn't a structure, it's a posture. You live in a battlefield disguised as a neighborhood. And no, the war isn't about land or oil or some 19th century squabble over trade routes. The reasons here are older, messier, and far more personal. Let's take the Yanomami for example. one of the most well-documented indigenous groups in the Amazon. They don't go to war because someone planted cassava in the wrong spot. They go to war because of dastardly things like sorcery, wife abduction, or a revenge killing that's been waiting its turn for 20 years. If your uncle died mysteriously, it was probably sorcery. If your cousin's wife was taken by the neighboring village, that's practically a declaration of war. And if your father was killed in a raid when you were still chewing on tree bark, congratulations, you've inherited a blood debt. The anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon documented it like this: alliances are made and broken based on kinship ties, and fights often erupt over women, not abstractly, but literally, as in, you took my wife, I'll take your brother's head. And it's not even always your wife. Sometimes it's your second cousin's, sister-in-law's childhood betrothed. The point is, it's all connected. Every insult, every betrayal, every spirit-summoned illness, it stacks up. And eventually, it explodes. And when it does, your village becomes a tactical target. The Maloka, the long communal house used by groups like the Tucano, Desana and Kayapo, isn't just where you live. It's where the soul of the community breathes. Burn it down, and you don't just destroy shelter, you wipe out stories, lineages, ancestral echoes. That's why, in a raid, the first thing to go is the roof. You won't find warning horns or village alarms. Your security system is your grandmother, who wakes at the sound of a leaf turning sideways. Or your brother, who hasn't slept properly in months because he keeps dreaming about jaguar teeth. Raids come at night, or just before dawn, when the smoke from the cooking fires still smells like home. And yet, no moats, no towers, no palisades. Because, to be clear, building permanent fortifications sends the wrong message. In cultures where bravery and honor are tightly wound into the cosmology of warfare, a village that looks afraid risks spiritual and political humiliation. Better to look vulnerable and be ready than to look scared. Of course, this doesn't stop the enemy. The Tupi, once dominant across much of coastal Brazil, were known for conducting large-scale war expeditions called cunhadismo, where they would raid other villages, capture enemies, and in some cases practice ritual cannibalism. You didn't just lose a battle. You lost your name, your bones, and probably ended up being eaten at someone else's victory feast. That's one way to write history. And so your family prepares, not by stockpiling weapons, but by paying attention. The trails are watched. The gossip is memorized. Every cough is spiritual surveillance. Someone's been seen wearing war paint too early in the season. That's not a fashion choice. That's a declaration. You don't get the luxury of feeling safe, because safety is a rumor, and you live inside a rumor mill carved out of leaves and fear. But don't worry, you're not supposed to be safe. You're supposed to become dangerous. Let me tell you about the child you could have been if your jungle cradle hadn't come with lullabies made of spit, fire, and warnings. You don't grow up in the Amazon. You get carved into it. If you'd been born into a Kayapo village, for instance, your earliest memories wouldn't be of toys or finger paints. They'd be of wasp stings, sweat, and ceremonial scarring. Your first haircut, done in public, with chance and sharp flint. Your first gift, not a rattle, a stick, wrapped in bark, symbolic of the beatings life was about to deliver. Because you're not a child, you're a future fighter. And nobody asks you if you want that job. By the time you're 6, your elders start watching you differently. Are you bold? Do you cry too much? Do you flinch at blood? These aren't idle questions, they're predictive analytics. The kind that decide whether you'll one day stand at the front of a raid or be left to guard the hammocks. Among the Yanomami boys are taught early that vengeance is not just allowed, it's sacred. Your uncles might whisper stories of dead relatives whose deaths were never avenged. And when they speak of justice, they don't mean trials. They mean sharpened arrows and long walks in the dark. You're not just inheriting names, you're inheriting grudges. And so, the training begins. You're sent into the forest with little food and no help. You fast, you hallucinate, you come back shivering and covered in insect bites, and everyone pretends this is perfectly normal. If you're lucky, you only faint once. Then there's the abina, a hallucinogenic snuff made from pulverized seeds, used not for pleasure, but for communion with spirits, ancestors, and sometimes just your own future rage. Blown forcefully into your nostrils by an elder, it hits your brain like lightning. Visions follow, or nausea, or weeping, and still you're told to breathe deeper, because visions are part of becoming a warrior. Clarity is pain-flavored, If you belong to a group like the Tucano, you might also undergo ritual seclusion, weeks of silence, no meat, no women, no sunlight. You're taught sacred songs, symbolic body gestures, how to invoke protection spirits before battle. You don't just train your body, you train your mouth, your dreams, your soul, and forget comfort. You'll wear a belt made of vines that digs into your ribs, because suffering sharpens awareness. You'll paint your body in black Jenipapo ink and red uricum, not to look fierce, but to show the community and the spirits that you're ready to bleed if asked. This isn't initiation, it's transformation under duress, and no one tells you when you're done. One day, you're sent to collect firewood, and a cousin mutters, "Don't die, stupid." That's it. Congratulations. You're now eligible to kill or be killed with honor. No badge, no speech, just quiet acknowledgement, and the deep aching knowledge that childhood, if it ever existed, is officially over. Because the next time you hear rustling in the trees, you won't be running back to the longhouse. You'll be running toward it. Let me tell you about the prep you could have gone through before your first ambush. In the outside world, soldiers train with drills. They check their rifles. They eat protein bars shaped like drywall. But in the Amazon, you prepare for war by poisoning your own nervous system, on purpose, with guidance, with rhythm, with pride. Because here, clarity comes through convulsion. If you'd been born among the Yanomami, you wouldn't march into battle with a steady hand. You'd stumble into it with dilated pupils and a head full of ghosts. The Ebenar snuff, pulverized bark and seeds, sometimes mixed with ash or powdered bone, is blown straight into your nasal passages through a long tube by someone who looks suspiciously pleased to watch you suffer. And suffer you will. Your face contorts. Your sinuses catch fire. Your mouth floods. And just when you think your spirit is trying to crawl out of your ears, someone says, "Good, it's working." The hallucinations aren't a side effect. They're the goal. You see the enemy, not metaphorically, literally. You see their trails, their plans, their weak spots, or at least, you believe you do. And that belief, that conviction, is part of the weapon. In these cultures, the real war isn't just in the jungle. It's in the unseen, the spirit world, the dream world, the realm of animal guardians and ancestral warnings. And the only way to access that intel is to bypass reason entirely and drop straight into altered consciousness. No PowerPoint slides, just plant spirits and nausea. Groups like the Tucano and Huitoto also used ayahuasca or yage in ceremonial preparation, sometimes guided by shamans who'd chant the names of rivers, birds, and long-dead warriors. You'd sit in a circle, drink the thick, bitter brew, and wait for your intestines to empty and your soul to feel like it's melting into the floor. This isn't recreational, this is reconnaissance. In the Shuar tradition, known for their ritual shrinking of heads, Natum, a type of ayahuasca, was used to enter trance states where warriors could see protective spirits and identify which enemies were secretly sorcerers. You weren't just tripping, you were strategizing in a cosmic sense. And don't forget mapacho, the sacred tobacco, not smoked gently in a hipster cafe. No, this stuff is inhaled, blown, or drunk in quantities that would kill your average suburban uncle. Tobacco isn't a drug here. It's an offering, a cleanser, a way to make your body inappetizing to the enemy's spirits. You go into battle stinking of the divine. And once your head is spinning, your limbs buzzing, and your stomach emptied of anything sentimental, the shaman leans in and tells you, you are ready, ready to kill. Yes, but also to survive spiritually. Because in the Amazon, if you kill someone without spiritual protection, their soul might follow you home and ruin your crops. Or worse, your sleep. So before the first arrow flies, before a single foot crosses enemy ground, you've already fought half the war inside your own face, and the forest hasn't even noticed you're gone yet. You wouldn't be trained to fight face to face. That's not bravery here, that's amateur hour. In the Amazon, the mark of a good warrior isn't how loud he roars or how long he lasts in open combat. It's how well he can kill someone who never knew he was there. The ambush isn't the dirty tactic, it's the gold standard, and it's got rules, sacred ones. If you were Yanomami, for example, you wouldn't even say the word raid out loud. You'd whisper it, maybe at night, maybe in code, after consulting the elders and the spirits. The planning would happen in low voices around the hearth, while the rest of the village pretended not to hear. Then you'd smear yourself in charcoal, chew tobacco till your mouth went numb, and leave long before dawn, barefoot and unscented. Because your smell can betray you before your shadow ever gets the chance. The group is small, never large. Large groups make noise, and noise is the enemy. You move in single file, stepping only on roots or stones, avoiding dry leaves like they're landmines. You communicate through clicks, whistles, finger signals, and intuition. Silence isn't just discipline. It's the line between life and becoming a cautionary tale. And then you wait. Ambushes in the Amazon are often acts of patience more than aggression. The shuar, for instance, could lie motionless in thick undergrowth for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the precise moment, not when the enemy is strongest, but when they're asleep, alone, bathing, or urinating. It sounds cruel. That's because it is. But cruelty here isn't unholy. It's cosmic accounting. Your cousin was speared last harvest. Someone has to pay. You aim for the most symbolic target, a prominent warrior, the brother of a known killer, someone whose absence will echo. You strike with a blowgun, a dart tipped with curare, paralytic poison made from vines, crushed and boiled into nightmare. One breath, and the body seizes. A few seconds later, they fall. No scream, no fight, just one more secret in the dirt. Among the Tupinamba raids were not just personal, they were theatrical. A successful ambush could lead to capture, not just killing. Prisoners might be taken, tied up, and kept alive until a ritual killing weeks or months later. That's how you cement power, not just by ending an enemy's life, but by turning it into a performance that everybody remembers, sometimes for generations. And here's the twist. None of this is seen as cowardice. Quite the opposite. To kill loudly is to invite retaliation. To kill silently is to restore balance. It's an art. The Ashaninka warriors would paint their faces in sharp diagonal lines, part camouflage, part spiritual focus, and strike from riverbanks, merging with the landscape like ghosts with better aim. No one will write a song about your ambush. No epic, no drumbeat. But if you do it right, the village you left behind will wake to smoke, a missing sun, and a very loud silence. That silence is your name. And back home, your people will already know, not because you said anything, but because the dogs barked differently when you returned, and the old woman by the fire started humming a victory tune she hasn't sung since her own husband vanished someone in 1973. The war isn't over. It just blinked. Some wars begin with a trumpet. Yours begins when the jungle goes quiet, and not a poetic kind of quiet, not that morning dew and birdsong kind. No, this is surgical. This is when the frogs stop mid-croak, when the parrots shut their rainbow mouths, when even the wind seems to hesitate, like it's trying to decide if it wants to witness what's about to happen. In the Amazon, silence is never just silence. It's warning. It's camouflage. It's the soundtrack of something approaching that doesn't want to be known yet. The Yanomami know this instinctively. Before a raid, they'll walk in single file, spaced out, no one speaking, no one even breathing loudly. You step only on soft ground. You hold in sneezes. If you cough, you bite it. A misplaced breath could cost the entire war. But it's not just about being unheard. It's about blending into the existing silence of the forest. There's a science to it. Warriors mimic the patterns of natural noise. A rustling branch is timed with a gust of wind. A twig snap is masked under a monkey's call. Your footsteps become part of the forest's music, just not the kind anyone wants to dance to. Groups like the Matses, known for their precision ambushes, go even further. Before an attack, they coat themselves in mud, smear their bodies with plant oils to hide human scent, and sometimes use leaves tied to their ankles to soften footfall. They're not entering enemy territory, they're disappearing into it. And if you're defending your village, silence is also your clue. The Ashaninka expert trackers teach children to recognize when a part of the forest feels ... off. Not looks off, feels. Like when the insects go quiet too early, or the birds don't scream at sunrise, or someone swears they saw a shadow twice and it moved differently the second time. There's an old Wittito saying, translated loosely, that if you can't hear the forest breathing, something is holding its breath. And in wartime, that something is usually holding a spear, which is why silence itself becomes a kind of warfare. Some tribes won't even speak the name of their enemy until after a successful ambush, as if saying it aloud gives them form, strength, or warning. Children are taught early that some names are only spoken when whispered to firelight. Others, never at all. Even communication during raids is silent. Warriors use gestures, breath clicks, coded whistles, things that don't travel far, or that mimic animal calls. One finger to the throat might mean target seen. 2 blinks might mean trap ahead. If you're lucky, someone grabs your arm before you walk into a pit lined with sharpened palm spikes. And that pit, it wasn't made yesterday. It's been waiting, maintained like a garden. That's how deep the silence goes. It has history, it has design, it has intention. When your enemy moves like this, like wind, like shadow, like regret, there's no screaming, no war horns, no last words, just one sharp breath, and then none. And by the time someone notices the dogs aren't barking, it's already too late. There's a kind of poetry in being killed by a leaf. A long, slender dart, carved from palm wood, dipped in poison that started life as tree bark and anger, now slides invisibly through the forest, weightless, silent, and then root to your ribcage. That's how it goes here. In the Amazon, the weapons are so quiet, they make your death feel like a natural event. You wouldn't carry a gun, you'd carry a tube. Blowguns, or pahim among the Yanomami, are often over 6 feet long, made from hardwood, with the bore drilled manually using heated wires, beeswax, and endless patience. They're not toys. They're family heirlooms, precision instruments, and in some cases, extensions of the soul. Passed down, cared for, smoked regularly to keep the wood straight. You clean it more often than you clean your teeth. And the darts, they're made by the hundreds, shaved from palm slivers, fletched with silky cotton or kapok fiber, each no thicker than a toothpick. On their own, they're just annoying. But dipped in curare, they become something else entirely. Neurotoxic little whispers of death. Curare isn't made in a lab. It's cooked over open fire, boiled with leaves and vines, sometimes with venom, bile, or crushed insects thrown in for good measure. The mix varies by group. Among the Matses, for instance, they combine curare with frog toxins and other hallucinogenic brews. The result? Paralysis, respiratory failure, and a death so smooth it's almost polite. You don't scream, you don't convulse. You just stop being a problem. And the range? About 20 to 30 meters for a precise shot, longer if you're showing off. But this isn't battlefield archery. This is up close, behind the shrub, hit before use melmi kind of warfare. Other tribes, like the Tukuna, favor arrows bone-tipped, fishbone barbed, sometimes carved with personal marks to identify the shooter. That way, when someone finds the body, they know exactly who sent the message. It's not just about the kill, it's about whose kill it was. Warfare is communication, and nothing speaks louder than an arrow with your cousin's tattoo on it, sticking out of someone's thigh. And these weapons are sacred. Before battle, they're blessed, sung to, rubbed with tobacco, painted with red uricum dye, not to decorate, but to charge them spiritually. The arrow doesn't just carry poison, it carries intention. If you use a weapon without ritual, and your enemy survives, the fault isn't just tactical, it's cosmological. The spirits might punish you with illness, infertility, or just bad aim forever. Among the Kiapa war clubs and ceremonial axes are still used for close-quarters combat, not for efficiency, but for tradition. The point isn't always to kill instantly. Sometimes it's to teach. A cracked skull can be a warning. A severed ear can be a message. Violence isn't random. It's curated. And if you think this sounds barbaric, remember, nobody here is fighting for profit or ideology. They're fighting for balance, reputation, memory. You're not just ending a life, you're closing a chapter, or opening a new feud, depends on the day. So you sit quietly in the leaves, 1 dart in the chamber, 3 more in your hair, waiting for the man who cursed your brother's name during last year's banana festival to wander too close. And when he does, you exhale. You don't wear armor in the Amazon, not metal, not leather. Not anything that clangs, chafes, or slows you down in 38-degree heat and 99% humidity. But you do wear something, your intention. Before a raid, before the dart, before the first twig cracks underfoot, you paint, and not casually. You don't smear some mud on your cheek and call it primal. This isn't Instagram camouflage. This is sacred protocol. The right paint tells the spirits who you are. The wrong paint gets you killed. Among the Kayapal warriors use black Jenny popple dye for the serious business of war. It's made by crushing the unripe fruit into a dark blue-black ink that stains the skin for days, even weeks, depending on how much you sweat and how many ancestors you've offended recently. but it's not the color that matters. It's the design. Each line, each curve, each negative space carved into your skin by fingertip or stick, it means something. A pattern across the cheekbone might say, I'm avenging my uncle. A band across the chest might say, I'm protecting the lineage. A blacked-out face with no features that says, I am not a man today. I am a weapon. The Yanomami go for urukam, the bright red paste made from unato seeds. Mixed with oil, it shines like fresh blood. They rub it into their skin, their hair, their weapons. Red is power. Red is visibility. It tells your enemy, I am here, and you should be afraid. Which is hilarious, because the whole point of the ambush was not being seen. But sometimes, you want to be seen, just long enough for them to realize they're too late. The Ashaninka are known for precise geometric body painting. They use fine brushes made from palm fibers to paint intricate lines, diamonds, and waves across the face, chest, and limbs. These aren't random doodles. They're protective codes. Each one is like a whispered prayer, drawn into the flesh. Before battle, the patterns become sharper, bolder, meant to confuse the spirits of the enemy, or at the very least, distract them. And then there's the Shipibokanibo, whose body art mirrors the patterns they believe exist in sound and energy, the invisible architecture of the universe. Painting yourself isn't about style. It's about tuning into the correct frequency before you kill someone. Harmonious homicide. Painting isn't optional. Not for warriors, not for raiders, not for the ones who expect to return home and still be recognized by their ancestors. Even the act of painting is a ritual, often done by a family member, a friend, or an elder. Someone who knows which symbols to draw, and which ones are better left unspoken, because mistakes are fatal. The wrong mark could attract the wrong spirit. A smudge could insult a god. A sloppy hand could mean your arrow misses and your enemy doesn't. And if you're captured and your paint is still visible, it tells the enemy everything. Who sent you, why you came, who'll be coming after. It's both signature and prophecy. So you sit in silence, naked but not unarmed, as your chest is coated in black and red, your arms wrapped in bands of color, your face transformed into a mask the spirits will recognize and maybe protect. Then you rise, glowing under moonlight like something half human, half omen, and entirely not to be messed with. You're not just ready to fight, you're painted to win. If you'd assumed the women in your village spent raids hiding under hammocks or fainting into ceramic pots, you might want to backtrack slowly and respectfully before someone hands you the wrong kind of tobacco tea. Because here's the truth. In many Amazonian societies, women don't wield spears. They sharpen them, and they remember who they're meant for. Among the Yanomami, when a man is killed in a raid, the women are the ones who keep his memory sharp like bone tips. His name is whispered, not spoken. His story retold, not forgotten. And when it's time for revenge, his mother, wife, or sister is the one reminding the warriors why their hands should not shake. She doesn't beg for justice, she expects blood, and she's usually the one who made the poison. You see, in several tribes including the Kayapo and Araweta, women prepare the korai. They gather the vines, pound the roots, boil the toxins down to that thick, tar-like syrup of paralysis. It's slow work, meticulous, not unlike embroidery, except instead of decorating shirts, you're prepping someone's last breath. In some cultures, women also apply war paint to the men, not as makeup artists, but as ritual conductors. The lines they draw aren't decorative. They're directional. A woman painting her husband before a raid isn't just saying, be safe. She's saying, don't come back without a reason. The symmetry better be perfect, because an uneven chest band could curse the whole mission. And sometimes, the war starts with them. Among the Tupinamba, it was not uncommon for women to sing jeer songs, public taunts aimed at cowardly or hesitant men. If a warrior refused to avenge a death or attack an enemy, the women might mock him with lyrics about impotence, bad hunting, or spiritual weakness. Think battle hymns with personal insults and better rhythm. If the humiliation didn't get him moving, nothing would. Among the Ashaninka, women would often sing ceremonial laments after a raid, wailing not just for the dead, but for the justice still unpaid. Their cries weren't mourning, they were strategy. Every note was a call to action, sometimes to the living, sometimes to the spirits. And yes, in some groups, women fought. The historical record is messy. Oral histories, archaeological evidence, and outsider accounts blur the lines. but women warriors appear across the region. There are tales of female defenders, avengers, and even leaders. The line between helper and combatant isn't always clear, and maybe it's not supposed to be. Because a woman who loses her brother in battle doesn't need a title to start a war, and she certainly doesn't need your permission. So when the longhouse quiets before a raid, and the men crouch in shadow with blowguns in hand, it's the women who pass the final words, the food, the charms, the memory. And if one of those warriors doesn't return, she'll bury the body and dig up the feud. You'd think killing a man would be enough. Arrow flies, poison takes hold, body falls, and that's the end of it, right? Not here. In the Amazon, death is merely a beginning. And if you're the one holding the weapon, congratulations, you've just triggered a metaphysical crisis. Among the Yanomami, it's believed that the spirit of the dead, the Norshi, doesn't just drift off quietly. It lingers, it watches, and if not properly managed, it follows. A wrongly killed man might haunt the dreams of his killer, spoil the hunt, sicken the children, or worse, whisper your name to someone with better aim. Which is why death isn't just physical, it's spiritual maintenance. After a kill, the body might be burned, or buried far from home, or never recovered at all, especially in raids. But for the slain warrior's family, the ritual continues. Among the Yanomami, the bones of the dead are crushed, mixed with banana paste, and consumed by close kin in an act of mourning known as endocannibalism. It's not for nutrition, it's communion. You're keeping him close, safely absorbed, safer in your gut than in the wild. And yes, it's unsettling, but it's also protection. The Shuar, famously associated with Zonsa, the ritual shrinking of heads, didn't do it for shock value. The purpose was spiritual control. The Musak, the avenging soul, could become dangerous if not ritually silenced. So they'd remove the head, sew the lips shut, boil it with magical herbs, and carry it during ceremonies to trap the spirit. It wasn't a trophy, it was a jail. Among the Tupinamba, captives from enemy tribes might be kept alive for days or weeks before being ritually killed in full view of the village. They were fed, clothed, even celebrated. But the end was known. The public nature of the death, the singing, the chants, the shared blows made the vengeance communal. Nobody could claim ignorance. Everyone became part of the justice. Even in groups like the Witoto, death in warfare required response, ritual speech, fasting, smoke, sometimes parades, because if a spirit died unavenged, it might turn bitter. And bitter spirits are unpredictable. They ruin crops, confuse hunters, curse pregnancies. War, in this worldview, isn't politics, it's weather. You don't stop it, you navigate it. And if you are the killer, then your problems have just begun. You might abstain from sex, meat, or salt. You might fast, paint your face black, sleep far from your wife, not because you're sorry, but because you've crossed into a space between worlds, a dangerous one, and the spirits have a tendency to notice. Even a successful ambush isn't over when it's over. The dead might call out, their names might be whispered by birds or appear in dreams. Children might start humming strange tunes. You might wake up one morning and all the fish have vanished. That's not bad luck, that's unfinished business. And so the cycle continues, because spirits don't forget, and neither do villagers. You don't scout enemy positions in the Amazon with binoculars. You do it while unconscious. Not because you're lazy, because you're tuned in. Here, dreams are not your private little theater of anxieties and sexual metaphors. They're briefings, warnings, premonitions, the jungle's own version of an intelligence report. Except it comes with more snakes and fewer footnotes. In Yanomami culture, dreams are called yuri, and they're considered direct transmissions from the spirit world. You don't just wake up and shrug them off. You wake up, report them, to your brother, to your shaman, to the person whose cousin might have just died in the dream. Because if you saw an owl, or a jaguar, or a man with no mouth, that could mean an ambush is coming, or that one needs to happen. You dream, and people move. Among the Shuar warriors were expected to seek dreams before raids. You'd fast, isolate yourself, drink ayahuasca or natum, and lie down in a place no one would dare disturb. The dreams that came, if they came, might show you a face, a direction, a failure. If you saw a snake crossing water, that could mean danger. If your blowgun failed to work in the dream, you might cancel the entire mission. Dreams weren't optional, they were military-grade intelligence. And there was accountability. If a raid failed, and the dream hadn't been properly read, or worse, had been ignored, the dreamer was blamed. Not always publicly, but definitely with lingering stares and fewer food invitations. Among the Ashaninka dreams were part of childhood training. You were taught to remember them, report them, analyze them, like small personal omens from the forest. If your grandfather appeared and handed you a spear, you didn't just smile in your sleep, you sharpened your real one. And if you were a shaman, your dreams weren't yours anymore. They belonged to the whole village. The Tucano believed that the shaman's dreams could reveal the presence of sorcery, hostile intent, or ancestral displeasure. If the shaman dreamt of a storm, preparations were made. If he dreamt of fire, someone was going to die, possibly soon, possibly in your hut. You could even send dreams if you were powerful enough. That's the most terrifying part. Shamans weren't just interpreters, they were architects. It's said some could project thoughts into other people's dreams, plant images, summon fear. You think you just dreamt of your dead cousin because you missed him. No, that was a reminder. And you'd better avenge him before the spirits decide you're no longer reliable. So you learn to watch your sleep, to guard it. You sleep with amulets, with painted wards on your skin, with tobacco tucked near your head. Because dreams can come from anywhere, and not all of them are friendly. You don't need maps here. You need REM cycles, and someone who knows how to read them. And once you've dreamt what you need to do, well, there's no going back. Let's say you've just killed someone, not out of rage, not by accident, not even for resources. You killed him because the world was unbalanced, and someone had to fix it. In many Amazonian cultures, war isn't chaos. It's not even about control. It's correction, a rebalancing of spiritual scales, where each act of violence settles a debt and opens a new tab. Among the Yanomami, this plays out through repercussion killings. You don't just attack an enemy village because they're nearby, or you want their fish trap. You do it because they killed your cousin, who they killed because your village once killed their uncle, and so on. It's not a feud. It's a cosmology, one body at a time. This cyclical logic is sometimes called no mohori, a vengeance ethic that makes war feel inevitable, but also necessary. If you refuse to avenge your dead, their spirits may wander, lost and bitter. And if you ignore that for too long, things start to rot. Your crops, your children, your dreams. The message is clear, something must be done. The Eraweta take it even further. In their cosmology, when someone dies, especially in violence, their soul embarks on a journey toward the sky village of the gods. But that journey can be interrupted if justice hasn't been served. So you make sure the killer's blood is spilled, not to erase the grief, but to escort the soul through the stars, without interference. Think of it as spiritual air traffic control, except the runways are soaked in red. Among the Shwa warriors go to battle not to cause disorder but to maintain Natamamu, a sacred sense of proper order and masculinity. A man who has not avenged a death, or worse, refuses to, may be seen as spiritually incomplete. It's not just personal failure, it's cosmic irresponsibility. Even the Tupinamba, known for their ritual cannibalism, believed that eating the flesh of an enemy wasn't savagery, it was a way to dissolve the violence, absorb the power, and prevent future revenge by fully integrating the enemy. A spiritual digestion, if you will. Brutal, yes, but in their view, also healing. And all of this, the raids, the paints, the dreams, the guts, isn't lawless, it's governed, not by written codes, but by memory. Elders know who killed whom. Children grow up learning the chain of vendettas like bedtime stories, not to keep the hate alive, but to keep the balance intact. Because if nobody pays the blood price, then you get sickness, barrenness, snakes in places they shouldn't be. You get gods that turn their backs and forests that stop offering game. You get imbalance, and in the Amazon, imbalance is a curse that doesn't end at the edge of your village. So you raise your bow not with hate, but with obligation. Not to start a war, but to stop the world from unraveling. If you're taken in an Amazonian raid, you don't get a number, you get a role, and it might be the last one you ever play. Unlike modern warfare, where prisoners are a bureaucratic nuisance, in many Amazonian cultures, captives are deeply symbolic. They're not just people. They're puzzles to be solved spiritually, socially, and sometimes sacrificially. Take the Tupinamba, whose rituals of captivity have been documented in chilling detail by 16th century European observers. When they captured an enemy, they didn't throw him in a cage. They brought him home, fed him well, gave him a name, and paraded him around the village like an honored guest. Children sang, women flirted, old men cracked jokes about his tribe's hunting skills. But nobody forgot what came next, because eventually the captive would be killed. Publicly, ceremonially, sometimes slowly, not in cruelty, but in meaning. His death wasn't just vengeance, it was communal renewal. By enduring pain without fear, he affirmed the strength of his captors and earned his place, not in the afterlife, but in memory. His body fed the earth, his name became a story, and the world, once again, was set straight. Among the Araweta, the ritual was less about torture, more about integration. Captives could become adopted family, given new kinship status, new names, even children. But make no mistake, this wasn't mercy, it was strategy. Incorporating an enemy into the community dissolved the spiritual threat they posed. Kill them, and their soul might come back angry. Absorb them, and they might come back as your nephew. The Kiapa were known for taking children as captives, sometimes in raids meant less for blood than for demographic repair. A rival village had too many boys, yours had too few. A child could be taken, renamed, and raised as if they'd always belonged. Years later, that child might not even remember the raid. Until, of course, someone mentioned it at a festival, and everyone went very quiet. Even the Witoto practiced forms of ritual adoption, and not always out of pity. Sometimes the captive filled the spiritual role that had been left vacant. Maybe a warrior died too young, or a spirit needed calming. The enemy child becomes the solution, not because it's fair, but because it's necessary. And what does the captive think? That depends on the culture, the ritual, the age, and the gods. Some captives accept their fate, chanting along with the songs sung over their own deaths. Others resist, curse, spit, or laugh in the face of ceremony. But everyone knows what's happening. There are no surprises here. Captivity isn't confusion, it's performance, it's meaning-making, it's politics wrapped in feathers and blood. You don't survive by luck. You survive by fitting in quickly, completely, or not at all. And even if you're spared, your identity isn't. That part of you, the one that belonged to your original village, is gone, burned off in the rituals, drowned in new names, rewritten in ink made from fruit and war. You're not a prisoner, you're property of balance now. The most dangerous man in the village doesn't carry a blowgun. He carries knowledge, usually tucked behind his teeth, smoked into his lungs, or muttered under his breath while staring too long at a bowl of fermented yucca. You may be fast, strong, accurate, but if your shaman isn't right with the spirits, you're dead before you step off the platform. Among the Yanomami, the Shapori, the spiritual leader, doesn't just bless the warriors, he guides the entire war. Before a raid, he'll inhale Yekoana snuff, enter trance, and speak to Zapi Ripu, spirit helpers, who dance on mirrors made of light. They whisper names, they show faces, they warn of omens. Sometimes, they tell him to wait. Sometimes, they tell him who's going to die. You don't argue with that. In fact, the raid doesn't begin until the shaman says so. And if he sees a bad sign, a wrong bird, a dead tree, a dream with too many ants, the mission is called off. Not because he's indecisive, because the spirits are watching. And once they're annoyed, no amount of muscle will save you. In the Shuar tradition, shamans called Yuishin are trained in both healing and harming. And that's not a contradiction, it's balance. If someone in your village falls sick, he'll blow tobacco smoke over their body, chant the name of the illness, and suck out the evil like it's poison. But if someone outside the village is causing the illness, that's a different kind of smoke. Because shamans don't just defend, they attack from afar. Using Virola snuff or Natam ayahuasca, they enter a trance and project. Their soul leaves their body, travels through the forest, finds the enemy shaman, and either warns him or challenges him. These are spiritual duels. No witnesses, no blood. But if your shaman loses, people start dying back home, fast. Among the Tukano shamans hold esoteric geography in their heads. Maps, not of rivers or trails, but of energy. They know which waterfalls contain spirits, which stones are gatekeepers, which animals signal shifts in power. Going to war without checking in with the shaman is like walking into traffic with your eyes closed and calling it a shortcut. The Huitoto shaman is also your storyteller, your meteorologist, your therapist, and your border patrol. He's the one who remembers when the last raid happened, who was involved, which songs were sung, and which mistake angered the forest. You may forget, but the spirits don't, and the shaman makes sure they never have to remind you too loudly. And while you're painting your face and sharpening your arrow tips, he's burning leaves and blowing smoke into gourds, asking invisible things for permission to proceed. Because, in Amazonian warfare, victory doesn't belong to the strongest, it belongs to the most aligned. And if your shaman is having doubts, if his chants crack mid-syllable, if the tobacco won't light, if his dreams have turned quiet, you don't need a spear to know what that means. You're already losing. You made it home, your blowgun's been cleaned. The red paint on your chest is cracking. Your feet are blistered, but still attached. And you're breathing, which already makes you luckier than someone whose name is now being whispered by a fire on the other side of the forest. So, is it over? Not even close. Because in Amazonian warfare, there's no finish line, no signed accord, no banquet of forgiveness. There's just temporary imbalance, slightly postponed. Among the Yanomami, after a raid, there might be days, sometimes weeks of ritual silence, fasting, and smoke. The body may have returned, or not, but the soul, that's still floating. And as long as that soul is unsettled, the village is unsettled. You'll see signs, dreams, omens, a sudden drop in game, a child waking up screaming someone else's name, which means the cycle isn't broken, just buried. For now. Among the Eraweta, peacemaking sometimes happens through marriage, literally binding former enemies by blood, hoping that new children will erase old debts. But everyone remembers. You might marry into a rival clan, and 15 years later, over fermented yucca and small talk, someone reminds you that your father once killed their aunt with an arrow in the spine. It's awkward. The Tucano navigate the aftermath with ritual, song cycles, ceremonial dances, tobacco offerings, not because they've forgotten who died, but because they remember too well. Every ritual is a way to smooth over the cracks, calm the spirits, and tell the forest, we're trying. Even among the Ashaninka, known for their diplomacy, peace is conditional. It lasts as long as there are no accidents, no insults, no badly timed dreams, or unfamiliar footprints near the manioc patch. One wrong word at a festival, and suddenly, those same warriors who toasted with you last moon are painting their faces again, because peace isn't a state, it's a behavior. You maintain it like a fire, constantly, carefully, never assuming it will tend itself. And if you think you've outrun the past, there's always a child, a boy who grows up hearing his mother sing morning songs under her breath, a girl who asks why uncle doesn't visit anymore, a cousin who finds an old weapon buried behind the longhouse and remembers. That's how it starts again. Not with hatred, with memory, because war in the Amazon doesn't end. It just forgets to wake up for a while. He didn't ask to be born. Most don't. But the moment the midwife felt between the legs and whispered boy, the verdict was sealed. Not a child, a weapon in progress. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, a newborn male was never greeted with softness. Among certain tribes, his arrival was less a celebration and more a logistical problem to be solved. How soon can we harden him? The Sambia, in particular, believed boys were born contaminated, soaked in maternal influence, fragile, feminized, in need of purification. His very breath, they thought, was full of female residue, and the only cure was extraction of fluids, of innocence, of anything remotely resembling a connection to the womb. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Spartan boys were examined for flaws before their umbilical cords even dried. If they passed strong bones, symmetrical head, no trembling lips, they were kept. If not, they were left in a ravine. The city-state had no use for Haftman. A future warrior couldn't start life whimpering under a blanket. He needed to face the cold alone, preferably while being judged by a council of older men who'd already survived 20 winters of phalanx formation and boiling pig's blood. But death wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a newborn boy. Living with expectations was often worse. In the Mongol steppes, babies were sometimes taught to grip a piece of leather as a first test, cry too much, drop it too icily, or refuse the smell of horse fat, and it meant weakness. And weakness, on the steppe, was a liability, not just to the tribe, but to the herd. To survive as a nomadic horse people in sub-zero terrain, children had to be fireproof long before they understood fire. Birth wasn't personal. It was administrative, a rite of paperwork in blood. Among the Maasai of East Africa, elders would make the announcement, not that a child had been born, but that a future Moran warrior had entered the world, and the countdown began. They had a schedule for this sort of thing: early childhood marked by mock combat, adolescence by lion hunts, adulthood by spears. No room for mystery, or doubt, or questions like what if he doesn't want to fight. Wanting had nothing to do with it. The boy would be shaped, or he would be useless. Even in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, among the Aztecs, birth rituals for boys were militarized. As soon as the midwife cut the cord, she would whisper a war chant into his ear. The umbilical stump was then buried on the battlefield, or in a symbolic location, as a sign that his body, from the moment of arrival, belonged not to the home, but to the empire. The boy's cries were said to echo future screams of war. In these cultures, gender wasn't fluid. It was sharpened, not assigned, but weaponized. A boy wasn't simply raised, he was carved, and the carving began before he could focus his eyes. The hands that cleaned him, clothed him, named him, they were already preparing him for a life of bruises, bone fractures, and bloodletting. He was a future memory in a battlefield before he ever understood what a tree was. Of course, carving alone wasn't enough. Once the boy's body was marked, painted, or scrubbed of maternal softness, the real work began. Training the nerves, because it's one thing to be born male. It's another thing entirely to sleep through pain without flinching. Crying was inconvenient, not because it annoyed anyone, but because it signaled softness, and softness, like rot, had to be cut out early. Among the Inuit, for instance, babies were swaddled so tightly they couldn't move their limbs for the first few months. The logic wasn't cruelty, it was containment. In a world where survival depended on stillness, silence, and the ability to conserve heat, flailing was dangerous, so the child learned to freeze literally before he could crawl. In many cultures, the cradle wasn't a bed, it was a blueprint. Spartan infants were bathed in wine to toughen them, the idea being that if they couldn't tolerate alcohol, they weren't made for war. Among the Mongols, babies were laid in cradleboards tied with horsehide straps, then left outdoors to get used to the cold. Some accounts say they were occasionally dunked in icy water, not to punish, but to prepare, to see if their hearts could handle the shock of future battles. And it wasn't just the cold. Among some Turkic and Kazakh nomadic groups, babies would be lulled to sleep, not with lullabies, but with the sounds of galloping or sword. Fathers would deliberately perform mock combat within earshot of the infant's tent. The rhythm of steel on steel became the child's first music. The intention was simple: normalize chaos, rewire comfort. In the forests of the Amazon, among certain groups like the Yanomami, mothers would rhythmically press the baby's chest and arms, not caress, press, as a form of stimulation. This hard touch was believed to train the body to resist fatigue and regulate breath under stress. It wasn't play, it was engineering. And as the child grew, so did the intensity: longer intervals without food, forced exposure to smoke, sometimes even being held near burning leaves to see how long they'd endure before flinching. The cradle, in these societies, wasn't a safe zone. It was the first gauntlet. Among the Maasai, newborns were sometimes laid on thorns for brief moments, their cries ignored as background noise. The point wasn't to injure, but to imprint, to make the brain understand that discomfort is not only expected, it's essential. Even in cultures where pain wasn't actively inflicted, comfort was still rationed like medicine. Among certain Andean highland communities, babies were carried in slings while mothers trekked steep, freezing hills for hours. No soft songs, no rocking, just motion. The child's heart learned to sync with a terrain that offered no flat ground. And while modern minds might wince, these methods were not random violence. They were structured, intentional. Cultural systems evolved over centuries to shape bodies into tools, and tools into weapons. The question wasn't, will he survive this? It was, can he carry the tribe's future on bones that haven't even fused yet? And those bones, they had deadlines. Because once the child could sit up, hold a stick, and focus his gaze, then came the toys. And by toys, of course, we mean weapons. A stick wasn't just a stick, it was a test. Could the boy swing it without hesitation? Would he cry if it hit him back? And most crucial of all, would he cry in front of others? Among the Apache boys were taught early that visible emotion was a kind of illness, contagious, weakening. If a child showed fear, it was not just a personal failing, but a spiritual one. Grandfathers would sit in silence, staring, offering no reaction when the boy stumbled or whimpered. The lesson was wordless but clear. Silence is survival, and survival is everything. In Papua New Guinea, Sambia boys were separated from their mothers before age 7 and placed in all-male initiation houses, where emotions were not allowed, especially not grief. If a child cried for his mother, he was ridiculed or beaten by older boys. Affection was replaced by hierarchy. Tears were signs that the maternal poison hadn't yet left the bloodstream. Silence meant progress. But even where physical punishment was minimal, psychological pressure did the work. In ancient Sparta, boys were intentionally underfed, not just to teach them hunger, but to watch how they reacted to injustice. Those who stole food and didn't get caught were praised for cunning. Those who wept when punished were marked. You could be dishonest, but you couldn't be emotional. Among the Inuit, storytelling took on a peculiar edge. Elders would tell children terrifying tales of sea monsters, ice demons, or jealous spirits, not to scare them into obedience, but to teach composure. A child who could sit through the story without trembling was favored. The world was full of quiet dangers. Only those who could match that quiet with their own silence were worth keeping close. Across the steppe, young Mongol boys watched their fathers ride into blizzards, return bleeding, and say nothing. When the boy first fell off a horse, there was no rush to lift him. Instead, the expectation was to stand, dust off, and try again without a word. If you cried, you were mocked, not cruelly, but collectively. Because in battle, the horse doesn't stop because you're sad. The wind doesn't wait for your feelings to pass. The Yanomami, too, practiced this early. Boys might watch their fathers return from a raid, faces unreadable, weapons bloodied, no explanation, no comfort, just presence. The boys learned by imitation. They learned that power is quiet, and that too many words dilute the strength of a warrior. They weren't told, be strong. They were shown what silence costs, and what it earns. And so by the time the boy could string a sentence together, the urge to speak had already been trimmed back, like overgrown weeds. He had learned to smile without joy, to ache without sound, and to bleed without ceremony. Speech was for ceremony or strategy, never confession. But action. Action was encouraged, especially when it involved tools, or, more precisely, weapons disguised as toys. Before a boy could count, he could aim. Before he could pronounce his sister's name, he could stab a beetle with a miniature spear. Among many warrior societies, childhood didn't begin with picture books, it began with blunt objects. In the Mongol steppe, it was common for toddlers to be given small bows, carved roughly from wood, and strung with sinew. At first, they barely had the grip to pull them. That didn't matter. The bow wasn't for effectiveness, it was for proximity. The child's hands were meant to memorize the weapon's shape before they could write their own name. By age 4 or 5, the arrows became sharper. By 7, the targets moved. In the Amazon, Yanomami boys were gifted tiny blowpipes to practice on birds, lizards, and insects. They would lie on their bellies in the mud, mimicking their fathers, holding their breath, narrowing their eyes, exhaling through tubes longer than their arms. If they hit something, the kill was celebrated. If they didn't, they were told to keep trying, not kindly, but bluntly, with the cold efficiency of a culture where error means hunger. Among the Maasai, young boys were given sticks to mimic spearfighting from the moment they could stand. These weren't games, they were rehearsals. 2-year-olds could often be seen mimicking charges, growling, or throwing themselves to the ground in exaggerated death poses. It looked playful from a distance, until you noticed the seriousness in their faces. They weren't pretending to fight, they were pretending to remember. Even in the Andes, Inca children were taught to throw stones with slings as early as 3 years old. The slings were dyed with natural pigments, and sometimes gifted with little rites. One account describes a child blessing his sling with a whisper before practicing a sign that the weapon was not just a toy, but a companion, something he would grow into, like a name or a destiny. And while Western children were being taught to use their words, these boys were learning that words were weak, tools had weight, and those tools, clubs, bows, slings, knives, blowguns, were all scaled down just enough to fit into chubby fingers. If the child cried after hurting a small animal, he was scolded. If he laughed, he was noticed. In the Sepik River region of Papua New Guinea, boys were sometimes given sharpened sticks with no instructions. The elders would simply observe what he pointed it at, what he hit, what he hesitated to touch. These were seen as early glimpses of temperament. It wasn't about teaching, it was about decoding. Even Spartan boys, between beatings and theft, were allowed to train with mock weapons fashioned from bone or bronze, but only after proving they could go a week without food or warmth. The weapon wasn't a reward. It was a reminder, your worth begins here. By the time their voices cracked, many of these boys had already killed dozens of insects, lizards, sometimes birds, and in certain cases, dogs. The progression was deliberate. First, you learn to hold the weapon. Then, you learn what it feels like to end something smaller than you. And eventually, when your skin's tough enough and your pulse doesn't change when you look into fear, they bring you pain. Not as punishment, but as initiation. Nobody said, "This will hurt." That would have implied choice or mercy. Instead, the boy was led quietly to the edge of the circle, stripped and held by men who used to be him. In the Sepik River regions of Papua New Guinea, the crocodile men believed that boys weren't truly male until their skin had been cut to mimic the sacred beast. Hundreds of incisions carved across the chest, back, and arms. No anesthesia, no interruption. Only a low humming chant and the smell of blood-soaked sago leaves. The child bled for hours. If he passed out, he failed. If he screamed, he was laughed at. Pain was not a side effect, it was the curriculum. The elders didn't explain what it meant, they simply watched. And when it was done, the boy was praised for surviving, but never pitied. In the Amazon, some groups took another route. The Satamor had a rite involving gloves, but not the kind for warmth. These gloves were woven with bullet ants, their stingers embedded inward. Their agony ranked among the worst known to humans. Boys as young as 12 were required to wear them and dance. If they cried, they had to do it again, 10 times. The ritual was considered a baptism. He left boyhood through fire, far from the jungle. In the dry lands of the Turkic steppe, endurance was taught through exposure. Boys were sent on solitary journeys, sometimes for days, with nothing but a knife and the instruction to return with meat. Whether they hunted or scavenged didn't matter. The point was to suffer without complaint. Those who came back limping or frostbitten were often praised more than those who returned whole. The Maasai scarified their young warriors as part of initiation. Cuts across the body, sometimes filled with ash or herbs, created permanent ridges. The purpose was aesthetic, yes, but mostly symbolic. A man's skin should carry history. If it didn't, he hadn't lived right. Among some Australian Aboriginal groups, tooth avulsion, knocking out a front tooth, was a rite of passage for boys during initiation ceremonies. The ritual, performed with a sharp stone or stick, often took place at night, in front of fires, with chants circling like smoke. There was blood, there were tears, but there was also pride. The gap in the mouth became a lifelong reminder. You've joined the line of men who don't flinch. And in ancient Sparta, the agoge was infamous for its casual brutality. Boys were whipped publicly at altars, sometimes to death, as a test of fortitude. It wasn't random, it was institutional. Pain was proof. The more silent you were while bleeding, the more honored your lineage became. These weren't punishments, they were sculpting tools. Childhood pain was a chisel, carving boys into symbols of fearlessness, or at least the performance of it. They learned that pain wasn't something to avoid, it was something to wear, like a badge or a scar. And once you'd worn it long enough, once your screams had dried out or your jaw learned to stay clenched, you were allowed something new, distance, from your mother. The warmth didn't end with the fire, it ended with her. Among the Sambia of Papua New Guinea, a boy was taken from his mother around age 7, sometimes earlier, and sent to live in the house Tamborin, the spirit house, a place of men, myths, and meticulously orchestrated detachment. He wasn't just being raised by the village, he was being extracted. From tenderness, from softness, from anything that smelled of breasts or lullabies. Contact with women was considered polluting. The boy was told that maternal touch had weakened him, and to become a man, he needed to purge it through vomiting, ritual bleeding, and forced insemination rites involving elder males. His body, they said, had to be emptied of his mother before it could carry the weight of the ancestors. He wasn't alone in this. Across warrior societies, There was a moment, sharp, deliberate, when the boy stopped being seen as a child and started being treated like a future threat. Among the Zulu boys were herded into age regiments where they would train, eat, sleep, and fight together. No female presence. The only comfort came from hierarchy. The older boys who hit a little less hard if you followed orders. In Sparta, this exile was written into law. At age 7, boys left home and entered the agoge, a military boarding system where obedience mattered more than kinship. Mothers didn't get to say goodbye. Fathers didn't tuck them in. The state became their parent, and discipline came wrapped in leather straps and cold broth. Even in the icy north, among certain Inuit communities, boys were taught early to hunt and survive with minimal adult guidance. Around the age of 6 or 7, they might be taken on a multi-day hunting trip with older male relatives. No coddling, no comfort, just lessons disguised as near-death experiences. Fall into a snowdrift, climb out yourself, lose your footing on a seal carcass. Don't whimper. The ice doesn't care. In the steppes of Central Asia, Turkic and Mongol boys were expected to ride by the time they could walk, and camp alone by the time they could speak. They were taught how to trap animals, tend fire, sleep without fire, and listen for wolves. Nights were spent curled in furs, blinking at the stars, remembering not to cry. Because horses, after all, get spooked by weakness. These separations weren't accidents, they were engineered. The logic was brutally clean. Men couldn't be men if they remembered what it was like to be held. Emotional detachment was a requirement, not just for war, but for leadership, ritual, and social power. Dependency was amputated like a diseased limb, and in return, the boys were given structure, schedules, chants, tasks that seemed impossible. And food, the kind that made you stronger, but not necessarily happy. No one asked if he liked it. Food wasn't pleasure, it was fuel. And in most warrior cultures, that fuel came with conditions: you ate to grow stronger, not fuller. Among the Spartans, boys were fed deliberately small portions, just enough to keep the legs moving, never enough to lull the brain into relaxation. If you wanted more, you had to steal it. If you got caught, the punishment wasn't for the theft, it was for the incompetence of being discovered. Hunger was a training tool. In the Mongol steppe, fermented mare's milk, dried curds, and strips of sun-hardened mutton made up the core of a young boy's diet. It was meat with muscle memory. You could eat it while riding, defending your tent, or watching your horse give birth. Nothing dripped, nothing spoiled, and nothing was sweet. Mongol boys learned to chew like it was a survival ritual, slow, quiet, and with no complaints. Down in the Amazon, young boys among the Yanomami and other groups might be fed mashed grubs, roasted ants, or fish wrapped in leaves. Protein mattered, texture didn't. Sometimes the insects were still twitching. It was common to test the boy's reaction. If he recoiled, it meant softness. If he ate without blinking, it meant readiness. The body doesn't have time to flinch in war, neither should the mouth. In the Arctic, Inuit boys were raised on seal meat, whale blubber, and raw fish, often eaten frozen. The goal wasn't taste, it was insulation. Blubber kept you alive when your breath turned to ice before it left your mouth. Little boys gnawed on cartilage like candy, learned to drink warm blood without flinching, and were scolded if they made faces. If you grimaced, the wind would mock you. In parts of East Africa, Maasai boys drank blood mixed with milk as part of their early training. The drink wasn't symbolic, it was practical. Blood is rich in iron and protein. It teaches the stomach to digest without mercy. Boys who gagged were watched closely. A warrior's gut has no patience for delicacy. Even in the Andes, Inca children were taught to eat quinoa, dried meat, and freeze-dried potatoes, chew no food that could last for months on mountain trails. Meals were silent, disciplined affairs. A boy who dropped food might go without the next one. Hunger wasn't seen as cruelty, it was exposure therapy. Across these cultures, food served two purposes: resilience and ritual. Certain dishes were tied to ceremonies, not in celebration, but in threshold. In Papua New Guinea, before certain initiation rites, boys fasted for days, then consumed specific roots or plants known to purge the system. Vomiting wasn't failure. It was cleansing, and the lesson stuck. That comfort was dangerous, that flavor was suspicious, that the mouth was not a place for joy, it was a chamber of discipline. Soon, they'd use it for something else. Not chewing, not complaining, but chanting. Because every good soldier learns to sing before he learns to kill. Before they were taught how to kill, they were taught how to repeat. A phrase, a rhythm, a call that meant nothing until it meant everything. Across warrior cultures, sound was a weapon long before the boy ever picked up a spear. In Sparta, marching chants were drilled into boys during the agoge as young as 7. The beat of the feet, the snap of the jaw, the exact rise and fall of the voice, all rehearsed until spontaneous. Chants about glory, about obedience, about the tribe over the self. They didn't sing to express emotion, they sang to erase it. Among the Maasai boys learned Engelate chants used by age-set warriors that invoked bravery, ancestral strength, and sometimes the taste of blood. The rhythm was simple, the content wasn't. Each song told the listener who belonged, who didn't, and what it meant to die well. Even before the boy could form complex sentences, he could already chant the names of his future enemies. In the Sambia initiation houses of Papua New Guinea, boys were woken with rhythmic drumming and forced to chant the same lines over and over about masculinity, about cleansing, about loyalty to the group. Sometimes the words were abstract, other times painfully direct. Pain purifies, mothers weaken, brothers endure. These weren't lullabies, they were neural pathways. The Mongols, too, used sound as glue. Young boys listened to Artundu, the long songs, sung on horseback across the plains. Though not always militaristic, these songs bonded them to the land, the herd, and the ghost pulses of dead warriors galloping through memory. It was said a boy who couldn't sing with control couldn't ride with honor. Among certain Amazonian groups, initiation songs were deeply tied to hallucinogenic ceremonies. A young boy undergoing his first ritual might sing while under the effects of ayahuasca or yopo, his voice trembling but persistent. The song guided him through visions, through jaguars, ancestors, enemy arrows, until he came out the other side, hoarse but reborn. His voice didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the ritual. And in the Arctic, Inuit boys learned chants not for war, but for navigation, to remember hunting routes, animal migration patterns, spiritual boundaries. These melodies passed from father to son, weren't sung for beauty. They were survival maps with rhythm. Forgetting a verse could mean starvation, or walking into a place where the spirits didn't like company. Even in the Andes, Inca boys memorized quipu patterns through chants, the rhythm helping them internalize information tied to warfare, tribute, or terrain. The empire didn't rely solely on scribes, it relied on memory, and memory, for a young boy destined for command, started with sound. Sound was repetition, and repetition was loyalty. To the tribe, the ancestors, the future raid, the invisible judge, watching from the firelight. And so they sang, loudly when ordered, quietly when punished, always when told. The boy's voice became an echo chamber for someone else's will. Soon enough, that voice would be tested. Not with words, not with song, but with blood. There's a moment, quiet, almost polite, before the first kill. A breath, a pause, a heartbeat in the ear that says, "This is the last time your hands will be innocent." And in many warrior cultures, that moment came before the boy was even old enough to grow a beard. Among the Yanomami, first blood often meant the first animal. A bird shot clean from a branch with a blowgun. A monkey brought down with a dart dipped in curare. The boy's success was praised, but not gently. Elders clapped him on the back, smeared the blood on his forehead, or silently exchanged glances. This was not a game. It was a sign. The next kill might not have fur. In Sparta, the child's first sanctioned kill might not come from the battlefield, but from within the training itself. There are accounts of boys encouraged to ambush and kill slaves during the Cryptia, a brutal secret rite that functioned as both surveillance and initiation. It wasn't framed as murder. It was purification, a test of stealth and ruthlessness. If he was caught, he was punished. If he succeeded, he was ready. Among the Mongols, boys learned to kill small game by age 6, hares, marmots, birds, all with bow and arrow. But by age 10 or 11, they were expected to participate in hunting wolves, not just for food, but to protect the herds. It was a dangerous task. If the boy missed his shot, the animal could turn. The kill had to be clean, fast, without panic. The boy who succeeded returned, not with a trophy, but with silence, the kind that changes how elders look at you. The Sambia were less concerned with animals, For them, spiritual rebirth and readiness were marked through ritual, and when a young boy assisted in his first real raid, the expectation wasn't just that he would observe, he had to strike. Even a symbolic blow was enough, as long as it connected. A bruise, a cut, something to mark his transition. If blood was drawn, the spirits were pleased. In the Amazon, some tribes had initiation duels. Two boys, face to face, armed with sticks or thorned gloves, were ordered to strike until one bled. It wasn't personal. It wasn't vengeance. It was theater, with real consequences. You didn't win. You endured. The one who cried first bore shame. The one who smiled through blood learned something more valuable than victory: detachment. Even among the Inuit, where large-scale violence was less ritualized, a boy's first successful harpoon throw into a seal or whale calf was met with gravity. He was expected to offer part of the meat to his elders, not out of politeness, but because the spirit of the animal had to be appeased. Killing was never casual. It was a contract. In some West African warrior societies, the boy's first blood was drawn during communal hunts, where success meant being allowed to carry the carcass home. A heavy burden, a right. Those who dropped the kill were shamed. Those who carried it without complaint were praised in riddles and songs. First blood wasn't the end of training. It was the doorway. From that point forward, the boy no longer belonged to himself. He belonged to the hunt, the raid, the code. And soon, when the voice deepened and the eyes stopped blinking at death, he'd be offered a role, not as a son, not even as a fighter, but as a weapon. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a blade in human form, sharpened through isolation, hardened by pain, and sanctified in blood. Across warrior cultures, the child wasn't merely trained to fight. He was transformed into a symbol, not a future man, but an active instrument, something to be aimed. Among the Aztecs, youth were folded early into the machinery of ritual warfare. Boys, as young as 10, were enrolled in Telpochcali, the school of common warriors. They swept temple floors, learned discipline, and marched in mock formation until they were deemed ready to assist in flower wars, those orchestrated battles designed to capture, not kill. Capturing an enemy was more prestigious than slaying him. And a boy who succeeded became a kind of priest without seso, offering life to the gods through death. In the Amazon, young warriors were sometimes selected not for their strength, but for their ability to enter trance. Hallucinogens like yopo or ayahuasca were used to induce visions of the enemy, of ancestors, of strategies. A child who emerged from the trip crying was dismissed. One who emerged calm and precise was believed to have seen what others couldn't. His role was no longer physical. He became the dream scout, the spiritual trigger. Among the Maasai boys trained as Moran didn't just fight. They embodied beauty, vitality, and the spiritual radiance of youth. Adorned in ochre, beads, and feathered ornaments, they danced before elders and the spirits alike. They were aesthetic warriors, living totems of tribal strength. When they marched, it wasn't just to intimidate enemies. It was to remind their own people that masculinity wasn't born. It was staged. In Sparta, the young men were deployed as spies, enforcers, and quiet executioners. Their obedience was so total, their detachment so cultivated, that they became ideal instruments of the state. They weren't asked what they believed. They were told whom to fear, whom to kill, and whom to obey. Their value wasn't in their mind, it was in their reflex. Even in the steppes of Central Asia, boys were taught from early on that their loyalty belonged not just to kin, but to the Khan, the warlord, the ruler, the voice of the sky. When they rode into battle, it wasn't for themselves. It was for empire, for ancestry, for something too large to comprehend. And because they were young, they didn't question it. They didn't need to. That was the point. Among the Sambia, after years of ritual, vomiting, sexualized initiation, and spiritual training, a boy became a full man, not when he matured, but when the spirits accepted him. His own body was a vessel. His will was shaped by unseen forces. His violence wasn't personal. It was sacred. These children weren't passive. They weren't brainwashed. They were molded, slowly, deliberately, and with centuries of ritual behind every bruise. They became tools of collective memory, carriers of war stories, living archives of pain. And if they survived long enough, if the weapon dulled, cracked, or outlived its usefulness, they might become elders themselves. Not necessarily wiser, just older, and very, very good at watching. It doesn't matter how many maps you've memorized. You can walk in with GPS, machete, and mosquito repellent strong enough to kill a mule, and still, you'll never enter the jungle. Not really, because the jungle isn't a place, it's a gaze. For the Yanomami, the forest isn't silent or still. It watches, not metaphorically, but literally. Spirits drift between vines like scentless predators. They perch in trees, trail behind animals, borrowed the shapes of snakes and moths and shadows that linger too long in your periphery. The Ochwa speak of Arutum, powerful entities that don't need your name to find you, only your footsteps. To walk into the forest uninvited is to enter someone else's house, barefoot, bleeding, and without offering. It's not paranoia, it's protocol. For the Matses of Peru and Brazil, certain parts of the jungle aren't just dangerous, they're sacred. Not because of what's in them, but because of what's waiting. Trees that hum when no wind blows, trails that vanish behind you, water that doesn't ripple when disturbed. These aren't metaphors, these are warning signs, and if you ignore them, the forest doesn't just get angry, it gets curious. Among the Tanamuka in Colombia, illness isn't always caused by germs. Sometimes it's because the forest looked at you the wrong way, not with malice, but with interest. That's often worse. A spirit that becomes interested rarely lets go. It watches when you sleep. It whispers under your hammock. It lets you get just far enough from camp that the birds stop chirping and the sky feels wrong. There are places even the elders won't mention by name. Not because they're scared, though they are, but because names have weight. And in the jungle, weight leaves a trail. The Kayapo speak of Karin, invisible presences that drift through root systems like blood through veins. If you say too much, they'll hear. If you say too little, they'll follow to find out why. And then there's the scent. Not of flowers or rot, but of something not quite dead and not quite alive. A sweetness that clings to the inside of your nose. Many hunters, across tribes, have stopped mid-hunt, not because they heard something, but because they smelled something that shouldn't be there. Sometimes they run, sometimes they pray, sometimes they drop their weapon and offer it to the dirt. If they're lucky, they're allowed to leave. The jungle doesn't welcome, it tests. And being watched is the first sign you've failed one of its many unspoken exams. Not because you're weak, but because you're visible. And when you're visible, something always sees you back. The trouble doesn't usually start with a scream or a curse. It starts with a foot in the wrong patch of moss, a glance at the wrong animal, a breath taken where breath wasn't meant to be. In the deep interior of the Amazon, especially among the Yanomami and the Piaroa, not all places are equal, not even close. Some spots belong to the spirits, and walking there without permission is like trespassing into someone's altar with muddy boots. The problem is, the boundaries aren't marked, no signs, no fences, just an unspoken knowing, passed from one leathery palm to the next, that you don't go there. Among the Quichua people of Ecuador, there are trees you do not touch, not because they're poisonous, but because they remember. Some are said to house sunki, spirit beings that guard the forest's balance. You snap off a branch, and 3 days later, your dreams curdle into visions of drowning or being chased by snakes with human faces. Coincidence? Maybe, but most don't take the chance twice. The Dayak of Borneo knew this well. Their shamans mapped invisible lines through the jungle like city streets. Violate one, walk through the wrong sacred grove, bathe in the wrong stream, kill a frog after sunset, and your name might end up in the mouth of something ancient. Not a god, necessarily, just ... something older than explanation. Even the act of looking has consequences. In certain Afro-Amazonian traditions, locking eyes with an animal too long, especially nocturnal ones like owls or jaguars, is a challenge, a declaration. Among the Ashaninka, it's believed that the spirit behind the animal can mark you, follow you, and begin the hunt. Not to kill, not yet. First comes the unraveling, confusion, accidents, food that rots overnight, fires that won't light. Children are taught early to avert their eyes, not out of fear, but respect. You don't look at the forest the way you look at people. You glance, you acknowledge, and then you look down. The forest doesn't mind being seen, but it doesn't tolerate being stared at. And when someone gets sick, a slow wasting, or sudden madness, the elders don't ask what they ate or who they touched. They ask where they walked, whether they sat on a fallen tree without asking permission, whether they pissed in a river bend known for its silence, whether they whistled at night. Whistling, by the way, is a calling. And in the jungle, calling invites company. It doesn't crash through the trees or knock you over in a fit of screaming. No possession is subtler than that. It begins in the margins. A word forgotten mid-sentence, a strange taste in the throat before sleep. The way the air suddenly feels heavier, as if you're being watched, not just from behind, but from inside. Among the Shipibo Canibo in Peru, possession isn't a thing that happens to the weak. It's what happens to the unlucky, or the proud, or the inattentive. The ones who mocked the wrong spirit. The ones who touched the tree with sap that doesn't dry. The ones who laughed during a funeral. The jungle doesn't forgive that kind of laughter. It starts with the body misbehaving. A fever that doesn't respond to medicine. A hunger for things not meant to be eaten. Water tasting like blood, or no taste at all. Elders know the signs. They've seen the way a child starts to flinch when there's no sound, or how a hunter returns from the woods with a full catch, but won't make eye contact. That's when the whispering begins. In Southeast Asia, especially among the Temir and Semi peoples of the Malaysian rainforest, these moments are understood not as disease, but as intrusion. A breach in the body's boundaries, not by microbes, but by beings, spirits that slide in through the ears, the nose, the cracks between dream and waking. Sometimes it's the soul that leaves first, chased out by fright. Other times, something slips in while the person sleeps and simply never leaves. There's rarely screaming. More often, it's stillness. A stillness that doesn't belong to children, or a sudden burst of motion, someone digging furiously in the dirt, or chanting in a language no one taught them. Among the Atwar, such behavior isn't punished. It's observed, not because it's harmless, but because it might not be the person doing it. Possession can mimic grief, or joy, or hunger. Some begin to sing endlessly, their voices raw. Others grow calm to calm, smiling as they describe being carried through the trees by invisible hands. These aren't hallucinations, at least, not in the clinical sense. They're encounters, unwanted, yes, but rarely random. Because possession doesn't come out of nowhere. It follows scent, sound, fear, blood, and once it settles in, there's no easy eviction. Unless, of course, you catch it early, in a dream, perhaps. And that leads us into the next trap the forest sets. Sleep isn't safe. Not in a place where the walls breathe and the ground remembers. Among the Ashaninka and the Shuar, dreams aren't internal. They're communal. Breaches of the spirit world that spill into the hammocks of whoever's unlucky or chosen enough to be open that night. Children are the first to speak of it. Not because they understand, but because they haven't yet learned to lie. A boy sits up at dawn and says the snake was whispering again. That the jaguar has his uncle's eyes. That the trees turned their backs when he ran. No one laughs. They ask which direction the snake was facing. Whether the jaguar bled. Whether the trees had faces. Among the Piaroa, dreams are diagnostic. The shaman doesn't wait for fever. He waits for someone to wake crying, or silent, or changed. Dreams are how the spirits announce themselves. Not with banners, but with teeth. You're rarely killed in a dream. That would be too easy. Instead, you're pursued, marked, watched. The dream is a map, but not one you can fold or read aloud. In some Amazonian traditions, especially among the Huni Kuan, it's believed that dreams are more real than the waking world. That this life is the rehearsal, and the dream is where the actual negotiations happen. With ancestors, with spirits, with the thing that's been following you since last week. They speak in symbols, yes, but also in smells, in wounds, in strange flavors on your tongue when you wake. A dream of water might mean thirst, or it might mean drowning. A dream of birds could mean travel or death. It depends on the wing shape, the direction of flight, the color of the beak, and of course, whether you woke up cold. That's a sign. The kind of cold that seeps through mosquito nets and touches only the spine. The Batek people of Malaysia believe certain spirits use dreams to send messages, warnings, requests, sometimes even insults. A dream where your dead grandmother speaks with a stranger's voice. That's not your grandmother. That's someone else borrowing her. You can't ignore it. Not unless you want to be found by the same voice in waking hours. What's dangerous isn't dreaming, it's dismissing. Saying, it was just a nightmare, in a place where nightmares can bite back. Where the dream doesn't end when you open your eyes, it just hides in your shadow until dusk. And when it returns, which it always does, it brings friends. Not all of them are kind, and not all of them stay in dreams. You can't reason with something that has no face, and you definitely can't punch it. The forest spirits that hunt don't announce themselves with roars or thunderclaps. They slip in sideways, trailing scent, shadow, and confusion. Among the Tucano, there are reports of people struck by sudden trembling, like being brushed by a wind only they could feel. Others recall the sensation of hands, large, cold, inhuman, resting on their shoulders just before collapsing into seizure or silence. No bruises, just the lingering certainty that they weren't alone. Touch doesn't always mean contact. In equatorial Africa, particularly among the Fang, stories persist of invisible arrows, pain that enters the body during sleep or while alone in the bush, bringing fever, hallucination, or a sudden inability to speak. There's no wound, nothing bleeds, but the target always knows. Someone, something found them, not by sight, but by scent, by memory, by trespass. For the Temur in Malaysia, spirit attacks often begin with pressure, a weight on the chest during sleep, a tingling in the scalp, a moment of paralysis that outlasts explanation. You might wake up unable to move, with your limbs as heavy as wet logs, and your mouth full of soil you never swallowed. Shamans explain this as a form of spiritual immobilization, a tactic used by jungle entities to wear down resistance, to prepare the body for possession or illness. The goal isn't always death, sometimes it's invitation. That's what makes it so unnerving. These spirits don't behave like enemies. They behave like guests. They enter softly, sit in your breath, smell your sweat, make themselves comfortable, until one day you flinch when no one's near, speak when no one's listening, or feel something watching you from inside your own skull. The Bakari of Brazil speak of spirits that wrap themselves around the spine, coiling like snakes beneath the ribs, squeezing every time the host tries to lie, or flee, or sing the wrong song. There's no defense against them once they're inside. You can't exercise what doesn't want to leave. You can only negotiate, offer tobacco, burn herbs, make promises you hope they'll forget. And just when you think you're safe, that the sweat is just from heat, the whispers just imagination, the numbness just fatigue, someone else sees it, in your posture, in your silence, in the way you stopped greeting the forest like you used to, because the body doesn't lie. And when it's being used by something else, everyone can tell, everyone, except you. They don't rush to help you. The elders, I mean. They don't grab herbs or chant prayers the moment you start sweating through your hammock at night. They wait, they watch, and sometimes they simply turn away, not out of cruelty, but because they know what's coming. They've seen it before, and they know that once the spirits have taken an interest, there's no quick way out. Among the Dasana, there's a wordless protocol. When someone begins acting strangely, sitting too still, forgetting names, laughing during funerals, it's not considered a breakdown, it's considered a message, and not for the victim, for the community. The elders gather quietly, not to heal, but to assess. Who saw it first? What did the dream say? Did they walk near the tree that shouldn't be touched? Drink water after dusk? Kill the wrong animal? Because being marked doesn't mean you're sick. It means you've been chosen. Not necessarily for anything noble. Sometimes you're just a convenient doorway. In the Congo Basin, among the Mbuti, the elders are finely attuned to shifts in behavior, the way a child no longer sings in rhythm with the group, or a hunter starts refusing meat. These aren't quirks, these are signs. They know when someone's center has shifted, when the spirit inside is no longer alone. In Amazonian cultures like the Sharanahor, elders rely less on confession and more on observation. They'll notice the sudden smell of iron in your sweat, or how dogs avoid your shadow, or how the fire no longer warms you properly. And they won't tell you what's happening, they'll tell everyone else. Because once the mark is clear, your body stops being yours. It becomes something to be managed, protected, contained. Sometimes you're isolated, not as punishment, as prevention. So whatever's watching through your eyes doesn't see too much of the village, or doesn't like what it sees. In some cases, the elders perform rituals not to cure you, but to confuse the spirit, to make your scent go cold, to trick it into thinking you're already dead. That's why they paint the body, not just for beauty, but to mask your spiritual identity, to blur the lines between host and intruder. If done properly, the spirit gets bored, moves on. If not, well, that's when the real rituals begin. And once the elders start singing in tones you've never heard before, low, slow, with words older than language, it's not for show. It's to warn the forest. We know you're here. We see what you've taken, and we'd like it back. But the jungle doesn't always return what it borrows. In Western stories, exorcism is war, holy water, shouting, fire, and fury. But in the jungle, where spirits outnumber people and no one has the upper hand, exorcism is more like diplomacy. Not because the spirits are reasonable, but because they hold the upper vine. Among the Shuar of Ecuador, an exorcism doesn't involve banishment. It involves bargaining. The shaman doesn't scream. He listens. He drinks. Often ayahuasca. Not to get high, but to see who's inside the body, what they want, and whether they can be persuaded to leave without collateral damage. Sometimes they can. Sometimes they can't. Sometimes they ask for things. Tobacco, blood, a song, silence. In Congo's Ituri forest, the ritual might involve dancers instead of priests. The Andaka people call upon rhythm to shake loose the thing that clings. They don't tell the spirit to go. They exhaust it, confuse it, outdrum it. Because not all spirits are evil. Some are just stubborn, and some are old enough to remember when your ancestors made promises they never kept. That's what makes the negotiation so delicate. Spirits have memory. The Yanomami believe certain entities keep track of insults across generations. Your great-grandfather chopped down the wrong tree, and now you've got fevers that don't break, and dreams full of ash. That's not a coincidence. That's a receipt. And the exorcism is just a very long and awkward attempt to pay the bill. The healer's job isn't to defeat the spirit. It's to prove the body is no longer useful to it. That the host is boring, polluted, spiritually bankrupt. They smear bitter herbs over the skin. They blow smoke into the ears. They chant names not to summon, but to embarrass. It's less like spiritual warfare, more like convincing someone they've overstayed their welcome. In some cases, the possessed speaks, not in their voice, but in a tone too smooth, or too rough, or too amused. That's when the real game begins. The spirit might lie, pretend it's a dead uncle, demand a human sacrifice, or simply giggle and vanish, only to return the next day. The shaman never reacts. He just continues the performance, knowing that spirits hate being ignored almost as much as they hate being mocked. And when the ritual ends, if it ends, no one celebrates. Because no one's sure, the patient sleeps. The jungle holds its breath, and the elders go back to watching. Because if the spirit wasn't persuaded, it was merely postponed. Sometimes, the body recovers. The eyes stop twitching. The appetite returns. The person learns to laugh again. But not always. Among the Matsis in the Peruvian Amazon, there's a quiet understanding that some people simply don't come back. Their bodies remain, eating, sleeping, sitting by the fire, but the spark is gone. Or worse, it's been replaced. What walks and breathes might wear the same skin, but something else is in control now. And not all spirits are clumsy with their disguises. The community doesn't talk about it openly. They offer food, observe carefully, and watch for signs, a sudden fluency in languages never learned, a preference for solitude, or a habit of watching people a beat too long. Some of these people become healers, others, outcasts. A few vanish into the forest without a word. No one follows. You don't go after someone who's already become part of the jungle. For the Fang in Central Africa, there are stories of double spirits, where the human and the intruder strike a bargain, a kind of uneasy fusion. The result is often madness, yes, but sometimes insight. Those who return with one foot in each world are revered and feared in equal measure. Their dreams are more vivid, their sleep more shallow, their laughter just a little too sharp. And then there are those who refuse to be cured, who begin to like the weight inside their chest, who call to it in songs no one taught them. Among the Kayapo, it's said that certain spirits offer power in exchange for permanence, strength, vision, influence. The cost: isolation, hallucinations, a body that no longer belongs fully to you. Western psychology might label these cases as schizophrenia or trauma, and they may not be wrong, but the jungle doesn't care what you call it. It only asks, is the person still with us? Do they recognize their child's face? Do they remember how to return home without a guide? Because possession isn't always violent. Sometimes it's seductive, a slow merging, a surrender. And when the elders see that flicker of choice, that moment when the hunted becomes the willing, they step back. Some rituals aren't meant to heal. They're meant to say goodbye. They never exit through the front door. That would be polite. And spirits aren't. They come in through dreams, scents, moments of weakness. But when it's time to leave, assuming they agree to leave, they take a different route. One that's messier, stranger, and often louder. In the jungles of Papua New Guinea, the Asabano describes spirit departures as violent experiences. The afflicted might scream, convulse, or vomit, not just bile, but sometimes strange objects, bones, teeth, stones, not metaphors, actual things, pulled from mouths that shouldn't contain them. It's not seen as magic, it's evidence, a sign that the spirit was real enough to leave something behind. Among the Yawanawa, the final stage of a spiritual cleansing often involves physical disorientation. The person walks in circles, repeats phrases, covers their eyes. It's as if the soul is recalibrating its senses, remembering how to see without interference. Elders say the spirit gets confused during exit. It tries to hide, sometimes in the stomach, sometimes in the throat. That's why the healer blows smoke under the ribs, chants into the belly button, taps between the shoulder blades. You're not exorcising a demon, you're coaxing out a tenant who forgot their lease expired. In the Congo, some Bantu-speaking groups practice full-body trembling as a final purge. The person shakes until their muscles give out, until the spirit can no longer hold on. It's not catharsis, it's physics. If the thing inside wants stillness, you give it chaos. And then, when it stumbles out, you burn whatever it touched. Clothes, bedding, sometimes even the floor. Spirits don't like attention on their exits. They prefer to slink away. But the jungle doesn't allow quiet departures. There are songs to sing, smoke to burn, eyes to watch, because everyone wants to know, is it really gone, or just hiding better than before? And here's the worst part, they rarely leave empty-handed. A bit of memory, a sliver of thought, the way your spine tenses when a certain bird calls at dusk. You'll always feel a trace of them. You'll dream in their colors, fear in their patterns. You'll never fully be yourself again. Just a slightly altered version, slightly thinner, slightly quieter, slightly haunted. But that's the cost of surviving a hunt you never volunteered for. And even when it's over, when the songs stop, when your name sounds normal again, the jungle doesn't forget who it almost claimed. Tea's not random. At least, not entirely. The jungle doesn't hunt just anyone. It picks, and it picks carefully. Among the Artois, it's said that some children are born with their dreams too close to the surface. They sleep lightly. They speak truths they shouldn't know. They flinch at certain plants without reason. These are signs, not of weakness, but permeability. The kind of soul that doesn't lock its doors at night. The forest notices. The Batek believes some people carry a kind of ancestral residue, the unfinished business of a grandparent who broke a taboo, or a great aunt who failed a ritual. Spirits smell that, like smoke and old clothes. You might not know what you're carrying, but the trees do. Even posture matters. The Huli of Papua speak of people whose heads hang slightly to the left, a tilt that signals the skull is too open, that something could slip in, if it wanted. These aren't medical diagnoses. These are patterns, observed across generations, whispered during long nights when the fire crackles and someone's missing. And it's not always the gentle ones. Sometimes the loudest, boldest hunters get marked, not because they're vulnerable, but because they're tasty. A spirit doesn't want a weak vessel. It wants one it can use, to travel, to feed, to be seen. The more you resist, the more it tightens its grip. But why does the forest let some go? Why do a few people, loud talkers, careless sleepers, clumsy children, walk in and out untouched? Maybe it's luck, or maybe it's that they were already seen and passed over. Not because they were strong, but because they were boring. The jungle doesn't waste energy on the spiritually uninteresting. Among the Shipibo Shamans speak of mirror hearts, people whose inner worlds reflect the jungle back at itself. These individuals are too slippery, too reflective. The spirits can't find purchase, they don't stick. These people often become healers, but not always. Sometimes they become drunks, dancers, or disappear altogether. Escape leaves a mark too. And in the end, no one really knows. Not the elders, not the possessed, not even the spirits. The forest is an old thing, with its own rhythms and its own preferences. And when it hunts, it's not looking for sin or purity. It's looking for a doorway, one that's cracked open just wide enough,